Okay. Can you hear me now? Good. You're muted.
Yes.
Okay. Good.
Luther,
Okay.
you're muted.
No one. Hello all.
Got it.
Debbie, Luther, intro?
We don't usually provide one, but okay. Welcome to Parashat Hashavua. And our visiting speaker, Rabbi Fred Schellender.
Not so visiting.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm
Good.
putting visiting in quotes.
Yeah, of course. So I just wanted to make sure that we located the still relatively new, amazing co-chairs of this committee and the energy and vision and breadth, as well as depth that we hope to accomplish this year. And more on this if we have time at the end. There are obviously real questions on what makes the most sense with comparatively limited clergy capacity in the coming year. If this is going to continue, I'm going to ask for there to be a sweat equity element where we rotate who helps think things through in advance, and more on that down the line. So welcome everyone, and blessed is the Holy One who enriches our lives through the instruction, right? Vitzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah, to soak in, to immerse in concepts, words of Torah. You can say amen.
Amen.
Very good. All right. A word in the grand scheme of Jewish unity. This is the penultimate week of difference and the last week of full difference between diaspora, more traditional communities, and either Israel, all communities, or diaspora, more liberal communities, because ever since Shavuot, the second day of which was on a Shabbat, and we don't believe there is such a thing as a second day, and so we went on to the next Parsha, as the Israeli calendar did. And if you're signed up for different listservs of Parashat Hashavua, most of those are queued to the diaspora observant. And so they've been useless ever since Shavuot, because we get them and it's like, oh, but we read that days ago. I'm already on the next week, right? So Matot and Maseh are a sometimes joined set of parshiot at the very end of the book of Numbers. And for us this year, Matot is a standalone, while everyone else is still on last week. Next week, it will be a double parsha in conservative and Orthodox diaspora communities, and it will just be Maseh here. And we will all say Chazak, Chazak, Vinit Chazak. And 2 weeks from now, we all enter Devarim together for the home stretch. So that's just a little context that I know many of you knew, but always got to wonder, what is the Parsha anyway? Which community? I don't know how many people are so mavenly and also with the adequate time that they have read Matot in advance of this Parashat Hashavua or come with questions, or in some of your cases, a lifetime of hearing Matot and having interesting perspectives on it. So obviously feel free to surface them as they come. Does anyone start with a burning question or observation about this Torah portion, which is, again, the penultimate in the book of Numbers? We're going to focus on chapter 32, which is the end, but it's really 30, 31, and 32. So anyone?
I just have a very simple question, just because I haven't been following. What does matot mean, and why was it called matot?
Tribes.
Tribes, okay.
right? Mate Yehuda is the tribe of Judah, and these are the 12 matot. And we're very much in, it's very tribal, this whole thing, here in the home stretch of Numbers.
Is there any particular difference or nuance between the words shevet and mateh? Shevet is also used.
There must be, and I've never either noticed personally or read a compelling when is which. But surely, yes. I wouldn't be surprised if one was the northern usage and one was the southern, as is so often the case when we have two words, such as for God, right? Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh versus Elohim. We're simply different names of the one God worshipped differently in different regions. And so much of our biblical story is the fusing together of the northern and the southern narratives after a couple hundred years of divergence.
Fred, my question is, what does it mean in the Torah to make a vow? And why were our ancestors making vows left and right when they had to disavow them repeatedly? I mean, what, you know, I know what the word vow means, but in ancestral context, it's not clear to me what place vows played in their culture.
Right. It's a beautiful question. It is across antiquity, right? The Greek mythologies also have painful vow stories. And it is a recurrent theme, and it almost never ends well, right? Which is why Kol Nidre at the Yom Kippur made so much sense, because so often when we talk about a vow, it's we think of it as, in retrospect, as a rashly made vow, or a vow that we simply weren't able to deliver on. The ultimate, of course, is in the book of Judges, which is very closely related to the book of Numbers, because this is about the conquest, and that, of course, happens more fully under Joshua in the next generation. But I believe it's chapter 11, the story of Yiftach, or Jephthah, right, who, much like some of the Greek stories, vows, you know, God, if you help me win the battle, then the first thing that walks through the door will be a sacrifice. And of course, it's his daughter. Like, how dumb can a smart general be, right? We have these stories over and over, but it was a feature of antiquity. It was how society and honor were defined in a culturally conditioned way, or all around the Mediterranean and presumably elsewhere. Those notions, you know, have shifted. You know, we could ask, why were duels so popular in America until just 2 centuries ago? Well, there was a certain honor code that just made sense, and therefore there were lots of them. And vows, kind of similarly, they had their day, and thank God the day went. But we can still learn a lot from looking at them. For anyone who doesn't know, vow is the link between the end of last week's Torah portion, which covered a lot of ground, and the beginning of this one, even though most of this one is more about the wilderness narratives rather than the laws that were delivered. But there's these laws about vows, a lot of which touch on gender, and in a lot of challenging ways, and that is not the part we're looking at today. But again, questions, observations, welcome before we jump into the latter parts of Matot. Anyone? Anyone?
Sure, just a short comment about just the fact that vowels almost always appear in a negative way, or the consequences, the negative consequences of taking a vow. You know, I guess, Mike, it's really just a question, and maybe it's something you can talk about as you refer to other parts of the Parsha today. So what are we supposed to take from that? I mean, is it a reflection of that vows are really not that compatible with either human nature or the complexity of the issues that we are taking vows about? They're so black and white. They don't allow for nuance. They don't allow for the fact that your daughter might walk through the door. You know, it's something we don't unpack nearly enough probably as we approach the high holidays. So I guess I'd appreciate a little, a little drash on what should this mean.
Hey, it's still Tammuz. Don't rush us.
Right. We just, okay.
But in Shul this Shabbat, we will be announcing that Rosh Chodesh Av, which really does introduce the countdown to the High Holy Days, is beginning. That is on Friday of next week. So we're only 9 days away from being 2 months away from Rosh Hashanah. So yes, it's never too early. You had a lot of the wisdom in your question, contained a beautiful answer. Does anyone else want to weigh in on the meta applicability of all this vow focus of our ancestors?
No, let's keep going, Fred. Let's start something.
Sounds like a side conversation. Okay. So all are welcome. We can crowdsource this. And again, it's not our focus today, but I would say that vows are about a multi-step process relative to others. So this may be kind of a Musar inflected, as so much of my and many of our Judaism is, Musar inflected answer. But vows are typically in relation to others, right? They can be in relation to God, but God is an other, and there's a relationship there. The most important ones are those that concern, us. And vow is both the possibility of being too rash in your speech or not, but it's also about delivery and consistency, tamidiyut, as it's called, to be tamid, to be always, to be regular, right? Which is a form of being dependable, right? Which gets to other well-known Judaic concepts like ne'eman, faithful, right? All of, right, from emunah. So vows, as much as anything else that our ancestors could think about, were like a lifespan of choices that we make, and became a great case study because so often they're also a flawed example, which doesn't mean, but we never got rid of them because it's still important sometimes, right? Go to American Jewish culture of the 1950s. How many of you either heard stories from parents or grandparents about, like, on Yom Kippur, I pledge $100, right? Like, this old model, right? But that whole shtick that was big in the Jewish community's public consciousness until just a couple generations ago was a form of vow, updated. So vows have their place. They are easily overstepped, and as such, they're a microcosm of life, and worth a lot of focus leading into Elul and Tishrei, and then worth annulling on the eve of Yom Kippur as much as we can, so that clean slate is real. That's my unsatisfactory, top of the head answer.
Yeah, but it's also connected to, it's part of the whole chapters and Pesukim, which are related to ethical and social human relationships. I mean, there's so much in the Torah which is not necessarily, well, it is secondarily, between the relationship of God, of people to God, but the relationship of people to people is so central to Parashat Kadoshim, for example. I mean, it's all about ethical and social relationships, and keeping your vow is essential to that.
Yeah, right on. Again, the centrality of relationship and of the delivery, the follow through. Right on.
I wonder about the thought about it, what I'd call it intrapersonal vow, where you're making vows to yourself about, resolutions, about change in behavior, which may be interpersonal in terms of, I'm not going to talk so much, I'm going to listen more, whatever your particular vows are that you make to yourself, and to what extent are you held accountable for those, even though they're not public.
Nice. Nice. Thank you. Good. Okay. While I'm gathering our stuff, and any other final thoughts or other broad questions before we go to chapter 32?
I wrote a poem called Bells, and it's been published online, and I don't want to distract from your main topic, but I'm happy to share the link.
Ooh, thank you. Please put it in the chat. Maybe we can wrap with it. That'd be beautiful. Thank you. All right. I don't want print layout. Sorry, I'm looking just to get this to a fuller screen, and there we go. Okay. All right. So, friends, this year, as many of us know, following the triennial cycle, in tandem with many shuls in the conservative movement, though there are lots of ways of doing triennial, just as there are ways of doing everything, we are moving toward the end of a 3-year cycle, where this year we've been reading from the final third of each, which means that we're getting closer to the maftirs. We usually keep the maftir, the final lines of any Torah portion, every year, and then we read the other chunks from either the beginning, the middle, or the final third. So in this case, our reading tomorrow is from the same story that is included in the maftir. And this is one of the more puzzling maftirs of our year, because it's picking up on an obscure question, and it makes no sense without the entire foregoing chapter. So for a little context on chapter 32, first this one. Okay, hopefully a familiar-ish map on the left, right? To orient yourself, here's the Dead Sea. And here is the Kinneret, which means that is Haifa right there, right? Which means that Tel Aviv is somewhere down here. Notice it says Dan, and the Tel Aviv metropolis at the heart of modern Israel is sometimes called Gush Dan, the region of Dan, because that was the biblical holding there when it wasn't Philistine, which it actually was most of the time. Notice the rather confusing thing that we have Menashe in yellow over here and Menashe in blue over here. That becomes important a little later. Notice also how many, there's an extra Dan up here. That's just, artifacts of history. Notice that like Zvulun and Yissachar are tiny. Why are they tiny in this region? What is east-southeast of Haifa Bay? Shlomo, don't answer. Anyone else who, unlike he and I, haven't like memorized maps of Israel? Because anyone? What's right here? Think topography. Someone unmute. I can't see everyone while I'm screen sharing, so just unmute and call it out.
Well, it looks to me like you're pointing to Emek Yisrael and the southern Galil.
That's the one. So the Kishon River runs here in amazing alluvial flatland that is by far the most productive cropland for 300 miles in any direction. Till you have to go all the way to the Nile Valley to get the next closest. And it is Israel's breadbasket. It is Israel's Ukraine, so to speak. And so these could be small because they're mighty. They have the means of production, and everyone else is dependent. So they don't need the same land mass in order to support the same population and develop the same level of sophistication and presence, right? Whereas Judah, the most famous because it survived, right, is much, much larger because it's in the hill country. And that's a hardscrabble existence. Jerusalem is not a logical place, right, for a major city. It works. It's already way past its natural carrying capacity, but it's not the obvious. The obvious is actually Afula, right, which is kind of the crossroads town smack dab in the center here of the Jezreel Valley. That is logical. And no accident that the ancient sites like Megiddo, which is where we get Armageddon from, are in that area, abutting the Emek Israel. Anyway, this is just one of many best guess maps as to what the tribal apportionment might have looked like. What is of interest for us is you can recognize the modern map of Israel with the Mediterranean coastline unchanged, with the Dead Sea changing but unchanged, the Galilee blessedly full again after years of decline, more or less the same. Of course, contested questions about up here. What the area that I'm pointing to the right of Dan, what is this in modern political parlance?
Syria.
Golan.
The Golan Heights, right, which were, of course, Syrian and then Israeli since 1967. This is considered annexed territory like East Jerusalem, whereas the rest of the West Bank and differently Gaza are occupied but not annexed yet. The Golan is part of a larger plateau. It's the highest layer of a high plateau that is sometimes called the Bashan, which is the area here in southern Syria and northern Jordan. The border between Jordan and Syria runs close to the bottom of the Golan Heights and up this way. So in modern terms, the area that we're looking at here to the right of the Sea of Galilee is part Israeli, part Syrian, and part Jordanian. And Reuben down here is all Jordanian. So we usually think of the Promised Land as more or less the modern Israel west of the Jordan River, the Rift Valley here. And yet we have 3 tribes on the east. What up? How did it happen, if it really happened? Well, that is the final piece of Matot, and it's got a lot of story in it. So we're going to quickly look at the story and a little bit of focus on a couple of the key verses. I just like it. Early on, you'll see Eretz Miknehu. It is a land of cattle. V'la'avadecha mikneh, and your servants have cattle, right? Like they're basically, these are rancher tribes in their self-definition, and they see this land on the east side and say, hey, this works for us. We want to settle here, and then we'll see what happens. And then when we get to verse 16, that Gidrot son nivneh lemiknenu. So here's mikneh again, our cattle, and we are going to build enclosures for the flocks. Nivneh, we will build Gidrot son, enclosures for the flocks, for our cattle, specifically sheep in this context. Po, here. Ve'arim letapenu, and cities for our children. That is the declaration of these tribes. And that becomes interesting and important. And And then off to the races. 8 verses later, Moses says back to them, and just plant the seed to see if you catch the difference before we even start looking in the English. So Moses says, if you agree to the stipulations that are in between here, Benu lachem arim letapchem. Go ahead, y'all. Build those cities for your children. Ugderot litzonchem, litzonechem. And build the enclosures for your sheep, for your flock, etc. So just, what's that?
I said, "V'hayotze mipichem ta'asu," the end of the sentence.
And, yes, yes. And that which goes out from your mouths, it shall be done, or you shall do it, right? Which is like, you got to keep your word, which is the vow thing. And that becomes the interesting hook where the vow conversation earlier comes into the geopolitical internal challenges that are going to come up. So, and then when we get to look at this in detail, we're going to see both a charitable and an uncharitable interpretation of these 3 tribes, Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. But notice there's Manasseh here and Manasseh here. Ergo, it is the half tribe of Manasseh over here. So 2.5 tribes on this side. And what are they doing? And are we with them or against them? And for that matter, Moses and God, are they with or against? So we're going to read very fast. I'm going to ask for a couple of out loud readers as I screen share the text off of Sefaria, because that's easy. But if you have your Plaut Chumash, you can go for that too. So volunteers to read, 8 to 10 sentences till a natural breaking point. We'll need maybe 4 or 5 of you.
I like to do that.
Awesome. Thank you, Carol. Start us off.
The Reubenites and the Gadites, is that how, owned cattle in very great numbers. Noting that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were a region suitable for cattle, the Gadite and Reubenite leaders came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the chieftains of the community and said,
a whole bunch of ancient places. Yeah.
Okay. And beyond, the land that Yahweh has conquered for the community of Israel is cattle country, and your servants have cattle.
You hear that, Moses? We need a place for our ranching. Yeah.
It would be a favor to us, they continued, if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. Moses replied to the Gadites and Reubenites, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? Why will you turn the minds of the Israelites from crossing into the land that Yahweh has given them? That is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. After going up to...
sorry, Carol, I'm just going to interrupt for a minute and I'll ask you to continue. So just notice the structure that it's the narrator voice in the first 2, and then from 3 through 5, it's the request of these groups to the leadership, to Moses, to the assistant lead priest, and to the chieftains. So they go plead their case, and then Moses begins a long answer in verse 6. It's going to take us all the way to verse, I don't remember, 14 or something. But this is the beginning of the answer, and it is, so what? You're going to let your brothers go fight and die on the front lines while you stay here with your cattle, right? I mean, you got to hear the negativity that this starts with. And then once it all unfolds, you realize that it was maybe a ham-handed request from the beginning. They should have said, we'll still be part of the larger endeavor. And then this whole misunderstanding could have been averted. But we now see one of the key themes of the book of Numbers that comes in over and over and over again, particularly in the latter half of Numbers, which is Moses's restless discontent with the arc of the people up to date, right? And this is all in year 40 at this point, right? So this is the beginning of Moses's farewells at a certain level. And he's looking back and he is none too happy. And the one thing Moses is happy to do is tell the story of how the people erred along the way. And that's the part that Carol is reading right now, starting at verse 8. Okay.
That is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. After going up to the Wadi Eshcol and surveying the land, they turned the minds of the Israelites from invading the land that Yahweh had given them. Thereupon Yahweh was incensed and swore, none of the men from 20 years up who came out of Egypt shall see the land that I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they did not remain loyal to me, none except Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and Joshua, son of Nun, for they remained loyal to Yahweh. Yahweh, incensed at Israel, made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the whole generation that had provoked Yahweh's displeasure was gone. And now you, a breed of sinful fellows, have replaced your fathers to add still further to Yahweh's wrath against Israel. Shall I continue?
Yeah, one more verse.
Okay, if you turn away from God, who then abandons them once more in the wilderness? If you turn away from God, who then abandons them once more in the wilderness, you will bring calamity upon all this people.
Okay, thank you. A long speech preserved where Moses is, like any incensed elder with I got one more chance to remind you of that mistake that you all made 40 years ago, and I'm still holding it against you. I love you, but I'm still holding it against you, and I'm going to remind you at every turn in the hopes that you will finally wise up, right? Kind of the tone here. So we get all this detail, nothing that we didn't know before, summarizing the whole incident with the tribes at the end of year 1, which is why we're now in year 40. And a reminder, this was worth an entire generation of exile over this. That's how grievous the sin is of turning the people away from the collective next step that must be taken, which is defined here as the conquest. Leave aside the morality or necessity of the conquest, but the idea that this people has a destiny, and when you stand in the way of it, that is the ultimate sin that one can, perform. And that was the majority report of 10 out of the 12 scouts back in Shalach was that. And this sounds like that. So Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, you just want to sit this out and you're going to take away the power from the people. You're going to have them question their morale because their numbers are down and more of them have to fight and die because you're living high on the hog here in the Bashan, in the elevated regions on the east. Not cool, says Moses. All right. Then 16 through 24, this great unit. So they correct themselves with what they should have said all along. Who wants to pick it up here?
Happy to, because I feel like I need to stand up for those who want to be in charge of their agricultural destiny.
Awesome.
Then they stepped up to him and said, "We will build here sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children. And we will hasten as shock troops in the van of the Israelites until we have established them in their home, while our children stay in the fortified towns because of the inhabitants of the land." We will not return to our homes until the Israelites, every one of them, are in possession of their portion. But we will not have a share with them in the territory beyond the Jordan, for we have received our share on the east side of the Jordan.
So if they'd led with that, it would have all been cool, right? Like, no, we're still in. Sorry, Moses, you misunderstood. We misspoke. You know, like, okay. And then Moses comes around, but he's still the vow thing. You're going to hear it over and over.
Moses said to them, if you do this, if you go to battle as shock troops at the instance of God, and every shock fighter among you crosses the Jordan at the instance of God until God has personally dispossessed the enemies, and the land has been subdued at the instance of God, and then you return, you shall be clear before God and before Israel, and this land shall be your holding under God. But if you do not do so, you will have sinned against God and know that your sin will overtake you. Build towns for your children and sheepfolds for your flocks, but do what you have promised.
So as we saw before, take a look here at 16. Vayomru, and they said, Gidrot son nivneh, that these sheep enclosures we will build lemiknehu for our flocks, po, here, ve'arim letapinu, and cities for our children. When Moses is quoting them back in this finger wagging, you better come through with that vow, it is, okay, benu lachem arim letapchem, go for it, build those cities for your children, ugderot letzonechem, and those enclosures for your flock. Flipping the order, that becomes potentially very significant. We'll get back to it. Okay, next volunteer. Shlomo, thank you. So round 3 is just more of the same. It's gonna happen, and it just happens over and over again that they have to repeat the agreement with a little change here and there. Go.
The Gadites and the Reubenites answered Moses, your servants will do as my Lord commands. Our children, our wives, our flocks, and all our other livestock will stay behind in the towns of Gilead, while your servants, all those recruited for war, cross over at the instance of Yahweh to engage in battle as my Lord orders. Then Moses gave instructions concerning them to Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the family heads of the Israelite tribes. Moses said to them, if every shock fighter among the Gadites and the Reubenites crosses the Jordan with you to do battle at the instance of Yahweh, and the land is subdued before you, you shall give them the land of Gilead as a holding. But if they do not cross over with you as shock troops, they shall receive holdings among you in the land of Canaan. The Gadites and the Reubenites said in reply, whatever Yahweh has spoken concerning your servants, that we will do. We ourselves will cross over as shock troops at the instance of Yahweh into the land of Canaan, and we shall keep our hereditary holding across the Jordan.
Considering that the Bible, the Torah, is so often sparse in its detail, this is a lot of repetition of if then. And are we clear on the terms? We know the vow, right? And that could be because the stakes are so high. We're going to learn later that this is a 14-year process. So the commentaries focus on the idea that the men who are the shock troops who now live, on the outskirts of Damascus or Amman, but they're at the front lines near Haifa, they literally don't come home for 14 years to those children in those walled cities up on the Bashan. So the stakes matter, and it's still a lot of detail. I see a raised hand.
Yeah, wouldn't some of this, whatever aggressiveness of the wording and the drama here, have something to do with the fact that this is Moses's last rodeo. So he, he wants to preserve a legacy, a meaningful legacy, and knowing that he will not cross the Jordan himself. So of course he's impassioned about it. But I think this is sort of maybe his human interpretation coming forward, and just wanting to make sure that history reviews him properly. I mean, if we were to believe that, this is what Moses actually said, all that. But I don't know. That's just something that strikes me as I look at this passage.
Nice. Yes, we are beginning the process of assembling Moses's legacy. He's curating it like a Facebook page, right? And that's what Deuteronomy is going to be. And Deuteronomy starts in just 2 weeks. So, but this at the end, as soon as we fast forward from year 1 to year 40 in the narrative, we're already in that home stretch. He's looking backwards, and everything is with an eye to his place in history. Right on. Jerry.
I'm just wondering, you said earlier how the real sin was not fulfilling the destiny, right? Which I thought was to populate the promised land. The land is actually promised, which isn't it on the other side of the Jordan. So yes, they are kind of saying, well, don't worry, we'll go fight and die for all the other guys, our brothers, our cousins, but then we're going to come back over here, which wasn't really the destiny, I thought, right? So why is it okay with Moses, or is what's happening here in this very last verse read is, well, actually, we will stay there, right? We're going to have holders on both sides. Is that what they're asking for here when it says across the Jordan? And so I'm wondering, yes, okay, so they're offering to fight. So why is that enough for Moses? Why does Moses say that's not good enough, right? You have to go where God told us to go, right? I'm just wondering. That's my question.
You are right to ask that. And I hate to answer as I will, but the underlying assumption of this stretch of Numbers and the whole story of the conquest is the core of the Zionist ethos that has gotten us in trouble of, quote, a land without a people for a people without a land. Actually, the Bible is quite clear. It is a land of people. It's a land of the Canaanite, the Jebusite, the Prezite, the Hittite, and 3 other ites. I forget, right? But there's 7 ites. There's 7 nations living on this land who we must mass murder. Right? It is manifest destiny. It is the discovery doctrine. It is all the problems that we're still dealing with in a post-colonial era on steroids, because it is proscribed genocide. Now, of course, it's attributed directly to God, so we can't question the morality. And also, we're told those are really immoral nations. Just remember the Sodom and Gomorrah story, like they deserve it, right? On the other hand, needless to say, we're on pretty thin ice there. So there is already a notion that we are the only ones who matter and the others don't. And so if we can enlarge our territory from the get-go, heck, right? Think like David Ben-Gurion in 48. Like, how much territory can we hold in this tenuous standoff with powerful neighbors? Well, if we actually can hold the Golan, we should. And that's more room, right? And then Zebulun and Issachar in the Jezreel Valley and Judah in the hill country, right? And all the others can have more, I'm going to have to say it, Lebensraum, right? The very language in German that Nazis used of living space, meaning living space for us at the expense of those who used to live there. And that is not a moral concern of the biblical author. And that is one of the great disconnects for the modern reader. But that is, as far as I can ascertain, it's, yes, this was not initially part of the plan necessarily, but the different places where the Torah records God committing to what the boundaries of the promised land will be have both a minimalist version that doesn't even include Tel Aviv, right? That's really just the hill country, and a maximalist version that would instantly spark World War III because it's parts of 6 modern countries, right? Stretching to parts of Saudi Arabia and beyond. So there's not just one voice there, but this seems like a stretch, and it is, and the redactors of Numbers had no problem with it. Bummer, but thank you. Important. All right. So notice so far it's the Gadites and the Reubenites. What's up with Menashe? It's yet another example as you look at the editing job here that there's fragments of memory, whether they are memory of historical events or memory of folk tales, we don't know. But those fragments got combined in weird ways. Nothing so far about half of Menashe. We read on. So it happens. I'm just going to quickly go through this part. So it happens. And you may remember our old friends, Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, Melech HaBashan, who became like the source of all these legends. He was supposedly a giant. It becomes, anyway, but Og, like looms large in the imagination. We have now displaced them. We have now killed the kings. We have killed the males. We have raped and enslaved the females. We have taken the cattle. Yay, us, right? That stuff is all described elsewhere, specifically to Sichon and Bashan, which is just part of that massive geography in what is now southern Syria and northern Jordan that we saw earlier. They did it, and the Gadites rebuilt all those towns, fortified enclosures for flocks. The Gadites did those, the Reubenites did those. They gave their own names to towns that they rebuilt. And now verse 39, the weird postscript, which is the Maftir. Out of nowhere, there's part of another tribe that wants in on the action. Who's going to read the final verses of Matot?
Okay, I will.
Thank you. Full circle. But you muted.
The descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh, went to Gilead and captured it, dispossessing the Amorites who were there. So Moses gave Gilead to Machir, son of Manasseh, and he settled there. Jair, son of Manasseh, went and captured their villages, which he renamed Havoth Jair. And Noba went and captured Kenath and its dependencies, renaming it Nobah after himself.
And he called it Novah after himself. That's the big finish of the story. Right? I mean, some maftirs are like, wow, remember Amalek, don't forget, lo tishkach, like that rings in the ears, and Novach was, what's that, the word I'm looking for, the Donald Trump diagnosis, was a massive narcissist, right? Whatever, right? Like, okay, weird here. So out of nowhere, one wing of Menashe, the Machir wing, elsewhere we learn there are other sons of Menashe whose descendants went in different ways on the west, but just did it. Like the stories in war of that one battalion that just sees what needs to be done and goes and does it. That was on day 2 at Gettysburg, the fight for Little Round Top. where that Bowdoin professor was so deeply wounded. It's one of those just most stirring stories of the war. Like, this has to happen. And had he gotten there 2 minutes later, and had his people not been so brave and the Confederates could have captured Little Round Top, it would have completely changed the dynamic of the battle and the war, right? Well, here, all we're told is not that he was instructed to do this, but half of Manasseh goes and attacks the Amorites in Gilad, right? And Gilad is another part of this coastal plain. Sorry, not coastal plain, this plateau on the upper right. So Gilad, Bashan, all these different names, which loom large today. Whether you're studying the geology, like Bashan is the volcanic rock that's up there, which is very light and porous compared to sedimentary rock. That is Bashan. And Gilad, well, you know, hell, such a good name we named our son after, right? But it's the geography that then became the area where Eliyahu Hanavi would come from, right? The greatest of our prophets, the one who's going to herald the arrival of the Messiah, is actually from the wrong side of the Jordan, because Gilad is over there, right? So it just happened that half of Manasseh did it, and Moses said, okay, facts on the ground. So you, Machir wing of Manasseh, it's yours, take it. And then they went on, because the work isn't done yet, and this wing went there and renamed it for them, and this wing went there and renamed it for them, and suddenly the map of the Middle East looks different based on the most recent military campaigns. Not that that would ever happen again on this particular piece of geography. Debbie, then Marilyn.
So I'm just like, if you didn't need to be convinced that history is written by the victors, this would be a good example. The other thing is like, just reminds us of all the many authors that were involved in the compilation of the Torah, because, you know, we're talking about the excerpts and highlights, you know, that one wonders chronologically when that was inserted compared to the earlier piece. That's, you know, just thoughts going through my head.
Nice. So history is written by the victors, so we have nothing from the Amorite perspective. But history is also written by the survivors, because sometimes the survivors are losers, but not total losers, right? Such that they're still there, and that would be the North, right? Because if we fast forward hundreds of years from this place in the narrative, we know that all these lands in the Northeast are the first ones to be conquered by the Assyrians in 722, who are hell-bent on the end of the kingdom of Israel and cultural genocide, right? They let many of the people live, but they said no more collective identity. Your 10 tribes will be lost. And that starts with Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh, because if you're sweeping in from the Northeast, right, you got to go through there to get to the rest of it. But the survivors of those losers of the North straggled down and mixed with the victors of the South in Judah, in Jerusalem, which is where the rest of the history got written, which is why there's so much focus on Jerusalem rather than Shiloh or Beit El or other holy sites that were more northern. And yet, though they weren't quite the winners, they were the survivors, and their stories still found a way in. So yes to both. Good history. Steve. And Marilyn, if you still want. Yeah.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you, Fred. You used terms earlier that I wanted to push back on. You said mass murder and genocide, but I think there's been a little bit of maybe a nuance to that in saying dispossessed and survivors, etc. Was there an instruction from God in that that was go into the promised land and eradicate, destroy man, woman, and child, or was it just to, you know, possess the land?
Verbatim in numerous places.
And sometimes the animals as well, right? I mean, everything.
Yep. Alas, This is not a modern PC revisionist analysis of numbers. This is the pshat. It says, extirpate the 7 tribes. It becomes later halakha, normative Jewish law, that if you ever meet a descendant of any of those 7 nations, kill them on the spot.
Okay.
And if you don't, you deserve divine punishment because you missed out on that core commandment to extirpate those 7 nations. The good news is later halachic authorities said, we're so not sure of exactly what the bloodline is that we can never establish with 100% certainty. And so as much as we would love for that halakha to still be operative, we're going to have to kind of mothball that one for now, right? But yeah, this is our people. This is our story. And we're sticking with it. Marilyn.
So one of the things that one of the things that's preoccupied me through my life has been why Judaism became such a small nation compared to Christianity. And this parsha is an example of the anger, the killing, everything that's sort of not very spiritual, right? And I just wondered, is there a relationship there between, do you think? I think there's a relationship there to why, that's why Christianity overcame, or Jesus being the loving God. Right. And yeah. Okay, so that's my.
Okay, so the very short version, Paul, who wrote 55% of the New Testament, is actually in Paul's voice. So really the overwhelming framer of this New Testament says that Judaism was a religion of law, but Jesus is introducing a religion of love. And who wouldn't go for that? Now the reality is Christianity would soon develop its law, which was just as bad as anything in the Bible. And we've got a whole lot of love. We've got a whole lot of love, right? But we express it in particular ways, right? Through mitzvot and stuff, right? Like we put boundaries around it. Like you must deliver at least this much love, right? Here's how it's expressed as obligation. And that's the broad piece. So I'm going to ask hands down because believe it or not, it's 1 o'clock almost. And we never got to any of the sources that I assembled. You'd think I would learn by now, right? But I just want to close the loop on this charitable and uncharitable thing. So what we know about Gad and Reuben is that they are cattle people, and they see this is good cattle land. We actually don't want to be in the mix for the farming land. Like, no, let Zebulun and Issachar have, this beautiful, fertile Jezreel Valley. That's for the farmers. We are the cowmen. And then only after Moses does his thing, they say, wait a minute, no, I forgot to include the song. Oh, the farmer and the cowman can be friends. Oh, the farmer and the cowman can be friends, right? So straight from Oklahoma, which was, of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein, a couple of nice Jewish boys from New York singing about Oklahoma. What did they know? That is, of course, the oldest thing. Cain and Abel is the first time that we have rancher and cowman. Rancher or cow person, right, and farmer. And we have it, Jacob and Esau and so many of those. It becomes a motif. And these are saying, look, some of the land here is really best suited for cattle grazing. We're cattle grazers. This is good for us. What do we think about Reuben and Gad in this generation? Once they've corrected the story, or how they correct it, starting in verse 16. Remember, in verse 17, they say, we will be the shock troops. But in verse 16, they say, Gidrot son nivne lemiknehu po. Here, we will build these enclosures for our flock and cities for our children. So there's a charitable interpretation preserved from an 18th century Moroccan text that became big in Hasidut called Or HaChaim, which is long, and I'm just going to summarize, but this is a good read of it. Why did they have to open before talking about the shock troop thing by saying, here's what we're going to do for us? And yeah, we're also still part of the whole. Don't get us wrong, but we're going to open with what we're doing for us. So why did they have to make this statement altogether? Shouldn't they have just led, right? All they had to do was give Moses the kind of answer which would demonstrate that he had suspected them unjustly. They would form the vanguard of the soldiers entering Canaan. Why not lead with that? Seems like poor communication, right? Well, the charitable interpretation is that we may be able to explain their statement through the help of Maimonides in chapter 11 of Hilchot Mechira, the laws of sales. This is like, obscure legal doctrine out of the Middle Ages, summarizing Talmudic discourse. And we don't have time to go through the logic of asmachta, which is here a conditional commitment or promise that a person makes, but actually has no intention of keeping. So the analogy that Maimonides is drawing out of the Talmudic discourse about a disputed bill of sale under conditions that you don't expect to ever be met. Yes, that's a category, right? The first party didn't expect to have to make good on the deal because they expected the second party not to be able to meet the condition in question. Think buying Twitter for $44 billion, for instance, okay? Right. Thus far, Maimonides. And in chapter 1 of the same treatise, Rambam had written the question and answer, what constitutes proper possession through occupancy? We're now getting to the heart of it. How are Gad and Reuben going to show that they have earned it and they deserve it, and yet they're still part of the whole? What does constitute proper possession through occupancy? Well, if he sold them a house, field, or gave a gift, the recipient must make some kind of improvement in the property under discussion, in addition to mere occupancy, in order for the transaction to be complete, i.e. the sale to go through, at which point it is irrevocable. This is charitable, because it sure seems like Gad and Reuben are not great communicators. They forgot to say we're still part of the whole people at the beginning, and then they're slow to say it even in their clarification, and yet they're saying, actually, this is about establishing even more land for the Jewish people, because we are going to develop it in a way that earns our occupancy, and we are also going to support our brethren in a way that earns our ability to move forward. Just curious for anyone who studied Western philosophy, influence on Thomas Jefferson, who basically articulated exactly this. Anyone? Early 18th century?
It's the basis of the Homestead Act.
It is, in fact, 1863, Lincoln and that Congress would actually take this logic there. But
is it Locke? Locke?
That would be the other correct answer of like who was most influential on Jefferson. Remember, he read both English and French. So in English, Thomas Locke was definitely the most important voice ringing in his ears as a young Jefferson drafted the Declaration. Hypocrite. But the French equivalent around the same time as Monsieur Locke was Monsieur Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Yeah. So Rousseau was a philosopher of property, much like Locke, right? These are the currents around 1710, 1720 in a post-Kantian era of Western philosophy, or late Kantian. And Rousseau makes a big deal out of this idea that the earth itself is unownable. But when you add your improvement to it, that solidifies your claim to that which is otherwise unownable. It is almost verbatim what Maimonides had written 600 years earlier, and I just thought that was cool and worth noting. That's the charitable interpretation. But Rashi is much more famous than the others. And so Reuben and Gad go down in history with a pretty bad reputation for this, because they were ham-handed in their conversation here. And later stuff would bear that out, and particularly Manasseh. Manasseh is going to get in a heap of trouble later. They and Benjamin become like the tribes on the outs in later history for different reasons, even though individual Menashehites will go on and do really important things. Gidon, most famously, before Yiftach, one of those judges who saved the people and united the tribes during their confederacy period, was of the tribe of Manasseh. So, Nivne Mikne Lemikne Nupo, we are going to build sheepfolds for our cattle here, which they say first. Rashi, the authoritative, right, First Crusade era, 1096-ish French commentator, they paid more regard to their property than to their sons and daughters. They mentioned their cattle before their children? What misplaced priorities? How far they have fallen from our common ancestor Abraham and the values of tzedek and mishpat that God says Abraham is going to teach his children. This is not tzedek, this is not mishpat. This is sick and wrong. You just don't do that. Your kids are more important, damn it. Moses knows this. And notice putting in Moses's words, not so, like no. And then the rest is essentially the quote, right? No, make the chief thing the chief thing. Keep the subordinate thing subordinate. First, build cities for your little ones. Only afterwards, worry about your flocks. Life before economy. Children before profit. Sadly, we still need that message. And so we have a timeless warning in this otherwise obscure passage to try to explain the patterns of settlement of Israelite tribes on the east side of the Jordan. Cattle first, a problem. If we had time, I was going to go into the whole idea of chalutz, because the verb right here is nechaletz in verse 17. And the first time we have the appearance of the word chalutz as a word is right here in the verse we were looking at verse 21, and then the plural chalutzim in verse 32. These, of course, would be names that get picked up on at the end of the 19th century. Here they are called shock troops. Later, it becomes translated as pioneer or settler. And of course, settler today could mean a whole bunch of things in that particular piece of real estate, which just shows how...
The word really means the one who goes first.
Right. So if we had time, we were going to look at the etymology. This is Strong's Concordance, one of many classic ones that analyzes it. And it is used in all of these ways as arms or armed, and to deliver, to draw out, to enlarge, to make fat, to loosen, to prepare, to put off, to take away, to withdraw oneself, including to equip and to strengthen. And so you can hear how to pioneer is related to those, to equip, to strengthen, but it shows the elastic semantic fields over the centuries as these words acquire new meaning. And only in the late 19th century did we need a word for people newly arriving in the land to do, in a way, what these shock troops did back in the old day, to enable a beachhead for Jewish settlement in the area. And the first waves of chalutzim all had a wide range of ideologies. They were not focused on dispossessing necessarily. Most of that didn't pop into focus until 1920. And Tel Chai is often considered the first time in the history of the challenges in the land where suddenly it was, oh, this could be a zero-sum game. And the Jabotinsky wing of thought was the first to embrace the zero-sumness and articulate a greater Palestine that would include the lands of Gad and Reuven and half of Manasseh, against the voices that won and said we'll barely be able to hold on to part of what's on the west side of the Jordan. But chalutzim developed out of this very passage and became hechalutz, the very influential movement, right? Here's their pin. There's a whole interesting history that we were going to get into. Here's the 1919, et cetera, and how big it was, right? So by the dawn of World War II, there were 100,000 people who would define themselves in the movement, hechalutz, that was named after a noun in our Torah portion. Just kind of fun. And the most famous occurrence, of course, always nice to end with song if we can. Zum gali gali gali, zum gali gali, zum gali gali gali, zum gali gali. Hechalutz leman avodah, avodah leman hechalutz. Hechalutz leman avodah, avodah leman hechalutz. Shabbat Shalom in just 2 days. Thank you for joining Parashat Hashavua. It's been a pleasure. I'll stay on for a few, and I will see you again sometime soon. Zoom gali gali gali, zoom gali.
Toda Rabbah for that rendition and for really a great different perspective on the Parsha. Particularly love the attention to geography, which for those of us who are not as fully familiar with the land of Israel, or at least in ancient times, I thought was really revealing. So